Apologize to my brother right now, or get your things and leave. I want you out of my house by tonight." Those were the exact words my husband said to me across a table, full of food, as I had spent 2 days preparing. His voice loud enough that the neighbors could probably hear it through the dining room window. His younger brother sat right beside him, leaning back in his chair like he owned the place, which, for the past 19 months, he basically had. He was smirking, arms crossed, watching me the way a cat watches a cornered mouse. He had been waiting for this moment for a long time. They both had. Every single person at that table was holding their breath, waiting for me to do what I always did. Go quiet, go small, go to the kitchen and cry into the dish towel, while the men moved on to dessert like nothing had happened. What none of them knew was that I had spent the last 3 hours sitting on the floor of my husband's home office, surrounded by documents that had completely rewritten the story of my marriage and my house. I'm going to share exactly what happened, but before I do, follow along to the end and drop the city you're watching from in the comments below. I want to see how far this story reaches. My name is Colette. I'm 32 years old, and I work as a freelance graphic designer from home in Hamilton, Ontario. I met my husband Fletcher at a mutual friend's housewarming party when I was 26. He was charming and funny and had this quiet self-confidence that I mistook for emotional stability. We dated for a year and a half, got engaged, got married. I thought I knew exactly what kind of man I was building a life with. The house was my idea. We bought it 4 years into our marriage, a semi-detached century home in the west end of the city with original hardwood floors and a backyard just big enough for a proper garden. I had spent 6 years saving for it, not from a massive salary, but from careful, stubborn, methodical putting away, and from the $160,000 I inherited from my late grandfather's estate. That inheritance had sat untouched in a trust account for 3 years, while I decided what to do with it. When we found the house, I knew. I funded the entire down payment. Fletcher had a better credit score and a more stable employment record at the time, so his name went on the mortgage alongside mine, but financially the house was mine in every way that mattered. Fletcher's younger brother Rowan was 29 when he showed up at our door with 2 duffel bags and a story about his landlord being unreasonable. I found out later he had been evicted for non-payment of rent. Fletcher said it would be a few weeks. That was 19 months ago. Rowan did not look for work. He did not contribute to groceries. He took my car without asking when his wouldn't start. He left dishes in the sink and wet towels on the bathroom floor, and helped himself to whatever was in the fridge. And through all of it, he had this casual, entitled contempt for me. The kind that never quite crossed a line you could point to, but accumulated like water damage, slow and invisible until the structure gives. He made comments about my freelance work being barely a real job. He told a friend of Fletcher's, within my earshot, that I'd been lucky to land someone like his brother. He once watched me carry 4 bags of groceries up the front steps without getting up from the couch. And Fletcher never said a word. He had a talent for not seeing what he didn't want to see. Tonight was supposed to be Thanksgiving dinner. I had invited my closest friend Priya and her husband, along with Fletcher's parents and a cousin of his who was visiting from Sudbury. I had spent 2 days cooking, roasted turkey, maple glazed carrots, a proper stuffing with cranberries and toasted pecans from my grandmother's recipe. I had pressed the good linen tablecloth. I had opened a bottle of Ontario red wine I'd been saving since the previous Christmas. Rowan started about an hour in. It was the way he said it, that particular tone, just loud enough for everyone to hear but quiet enough that you felt unreasonable for reacting. He picked up the gravy boat, looked into it, and said, "Did you make this from a packet again, Colette?" You can always tell. I had made that gravy from scratch. From drippings I'd been careful to reserve and reduce. I felt every eye at the table move toward me. I kept my voice level. I said the gravy was made from scratch, and I asked him if he could pass the bread rolls. He shrugged like I'd said something faintly irritating and said, I'm just saying, Fletcher's mom makes real gravy, no offense. Fletcher's mother, to her credit, looked down at her plate. But Fletcher said nothing. Half an hour later, Rowan reached across the table for the wine bottle without asking, knocked over a full glass, and the red spread in a wide, dark arc across the white tablecloth. Across my grandmother's tablecloth, the one she had brought from Quebec decades ago, the one I'd had dry cleaned and kept folded in a cedar chest between uses. He did not apologize. He grabbed his own napkin to blot at his shirt sleeve and said, "Someone put the wine too close to the edge." I set my fork down. I asked him, quietly and directly, if he could please go to the kitchen and bring back a damp cloth to help me blot the stain before it set permanently. He looked at me as though I had asked him to rewire the electrical panel. And then Fletcher's chair scraped back hard against the hardwood. "Apologize to my brother right now, or get your things and leave. I want you out of my house by tonight." The table went completely silent. Rowan leaned back further in his chair, arms folding, a slow satisfaction settling over his face. Fletcher's finger was extended toward the front door. His face was the color of the wine still spreading across my grandmother's tablecloth. He had been building to this all evening. I could see it clearly now. He had been waiting for me to give him a reason he could point to. I looked at Fletcher. I looked at Rowan. I looked at the stain on the tablecloth. And something inside me didn't break. It just stilled. Because what Fletcher did not know, what none of them knew, was what I had found 3 hours earlier, in his home office, while I was looking for my SIN card. I needed it for a new freelance contract that required identity verification before the long weekend. Fletcher kept our important documents in a locked filing cabinet in his office, and he'd given me the spare keys years ago for exactly this kind of situation. I found my SIN card without any trouble, tucked into a manila envelope in the second drawer. But the drawer was harder to close than I remembered, like something at the back was wedged against the frame. I reached in to adjust it and felt a second envelope, thicker, pushed all the way to the rear. I don't know what made me pull it out. Habit, maybe. Or some quiet instinct I had spent too long ignoring. Inside was a HELOC agreement. For those unfamiliar, a HELOC is a home equity line of credit, a loan product offered by Canadian banks that lets you borrow against the existing equity in your home. Both co-owners of the property are required to sign. The amount on the agreement I was holding was $95,000. There were 2 signatures on it. One was Fletcher's, the other was supposed to be mine. I have my own signature memorized the way you memorize your own face. The double loop in the C. The way the tail of the E extends slightly longer than it should. A habit from signing my name on drawings as a teenager. The signature on that document was not mine. Someone had copied it. Carefully, but not carefully enough for someone who knew what to look for. I sat down on the office floor without meaning to. I kept reading. The HELOC had been approved 11 months ago through a bank branch on the east side of the city, a branch I had never visited. The funds had been disbursed in 2 tranches over 6 weeks. I followed the paper trail inside the envelope, and it led to a secondary account I had never known existed, held jointly in Fletcher and Rowan's names. From that account, over the course of 7 months, the money had been moved out in a series of transfers that matched almost perfectly with a typed ledger I found folded behind the HELOC papers. A careful, methodical record of debt repayments to what appeared to be a private creditor with dates and dollar amounts and a running balance. Rowan owed $127,000 to a private lender, online sports betting platforms, and, further back in the ledger, 2 separate poker operations. The record-keeping was precise, the kind a person maintains when they are in serious trouble and trying to track exactly how far they have left to go before they are out from under it. They had used my house, the house I had bought with my grandfather's money, the house that should have been protected under my inheritance trust, as a private fund to quietly clear Rowan's debt. And they had forged my signature to make it happen. I stayed on the floor of that office for a long time. The grief was real. I will not pretend it wasn't. I had loved Fletcher. Or at least I had genuinely loved the person I believed he was. Sitting there on the carpet, surrounded by those papers, I could see with complete clarity that the man I thought I'd married had never quite existed. Or if he had made a series of deliberate choices that meant he no longer did. But grief and defeat are not the same thing. And I had 3 hours before the first guests arrived. I photographed every document with my phone, every page, every signature, every transfer record and ledger entry. Then I called my lawyer. She had handled my freelance contracts for years, and 6 months earlier, when things between Fletcher and me had quietly begun to feel wrong in ways I couldn't articulate, she had referred me to a family law colleague she trusted. That colleague had given me a preliminary consultation I had filed away and hoped I would never need. I needed it now. Within 40 minutes, I had spoken to both of them and had a plan. I also called the bank's fraud line and reported the forged signature and the unauthorized HELOC. I also called Priya and asked her to please still come to dinner. I needed someone there who was on my side. Then I placed every document back exactly where I had found it, pressed the drawer firmly closed, and went downstairs to finish the turkey. And I sat through an hour of Rowan's careful, incremental humiliation. I sat through the comment about the gravy, and the spilled wine, and the shrug. I sat through Fletcher's silence, and his parents' careful neutrality, and Rowan's settled, proprietary comfort in a house he had contributed nothing to. I sat through all of it with the particular patience of someone who already knows how the evening is going to end. When Fletcher stood up and pointed at the door and told me to get my things and leave, because this was his house, I already knew that wasn't true. Not legally. Not on any document that would hold up in a provincial court. I pushed my chair back slowly and stood up. Fletcher's expression shifted into something that looked like relief. Like he'd finally gotten through. Beside him, Rowan uncrossed and recrossed his arms, settling back. He was getting comfortable. I did not go toward the front door. I walked around the table. I walked past Priya, who met my eyes for just a moment without moving. I kept walking until I was standing directly beside Rowan's chair. I leaned down until I was close enough that I didn't need to raise my voice at all. I know about the HELOC, I said. The $95,000 one. The one with my forged signature on it. I know about the joint account you and my husband used to move the funds through. And I know about the private debt ledger I found with it. The bank's fraud department received a call from me about 90 minutes ago. My lawyer filed a formal notice with the Provincial Land Registry this afternoon, and every photograph I took of those documents is sitting on a secure server that my lawyer has access to right now. I straightened up. Rowan had gone white. Not pale. White, the particular shade that happens when blood simply abandons a face. He was gripping the edge of the table with both hands, and I could see them shaking from where I stood. The smirk was gone completely and immediately, as if it had never been there. "What did you just say to him?" Fletcher's voice came from across the table. The arrogance was still in it, but the certainty beneath it was already cracking. "Ask him yourself," I said, clearly enough for everyone in the room to hear. "Ask your brother why the bank's fraud team will be contacting him before this dinner is finished. Ask him how much of my grandfather's inheritance he's already gone through." I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out the photographs I had printed quietly in the half-hour before the guests arrived. I set the stack in the center of the table, directly in front of Fletcher, on top of the wine-stained tablecloth. "That is a copy of the HELOC agreement with the forged signature," I said, pointing to the top sheet. "And that document beneath it is the land registry confirmation, showing that this property was purchased using funds from my personal inheritance trust. Your name is on the mortgage, Fletcher. But you did not buy this house. I did. Every dollar of the down payment came from my grandfather's estate. which means the speech you just gave me about this being. Your house is going to be a very difficult position to hold up in family court. Fletcher picked up the papers. He set them down. He picked them up again. He looked at Rowan. Rowan was staring at the tablecloth. Colette, this, Fletcher started, and then stopped, because there was nowhere for the sentence to go. What I'm serious about right now, I said, is giving you the same 30-minute courtesy you just extended to me. Both of you. Collect your personal belongings and leave this property. If either of you is still here when I lock the front door, I will be calling the non-emergency police line, and my lawyer will have the formal fraud charges filed before the long weekend is over. The room stayed completely still. Priya did not move. Fletcher's parents stared at their plates. His cousin had shifted his chair back a few inches from the table, quietly signaling that he wanted no part of what was happening. 28 minutes later, I stood on the front porch in the October chill and watched Fletcher carry garbage bags to the back of his car. Rowan sat in the passenger seat the entire time and never once looked up at the house. When the taillights turned the corner and disappeared, I went back inside. Priya was at the kitchen counter with 2 mugs of tea. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "I have been waiting 2.5 years to watch you do that." I didn't cry until much later that night, and when I did, it wasn't the kind of crying that comes from losing something. It was the other kind. The release that follows putting down something heavy you'd been carrying so long you had stopped noticing the weight. The weeks that followed were swift in some ways and very slow in others. Rowan was formally notified by the bank of the fraud investigation within 72 hours. His private creditor had apparently already been tracking him. With the HELOC frozen and his means of repayment cut off, he was facing both a civil debt action and a criminal fraud complaint filed through my lawyer. The last information I received, through a mutual connection, was that he had moved back to his parents' house and was working 2 jobs, not rebuilding anything exactly, but beginning to repay what he had taken. Fletcher retained his own lawyer, who confirmed relatively quickly what mine had already established. The down payment records, the inheritance trust documentation, and the paper trail from my grandfather's estate made it very difficult to argue that Fletcher held significant equity beyond his own mortgage payments. We negotiated for just over 3 months. It was not pleasant, but it was finite. The house remained mine. I listed it the following spring. I had expected to feel grief the morning the for sale sign went up on the front lawn. What I actually felt was something quieter, a readiness I hadn't anticipated. The house sold in 11 days above asking to a young couple who walked through it twice in one afternoon. I shook their hands at the closing and meant it when I wished them well there. I moved to Halifax. It wasn't a plan I had made in advance, but once I sat with the question of where I actually wanted to be, not where circumstance had placed me, not where I had stayed out of inertia and habit and the effort of starting over. Halifax made sense in a way that felt true. The ocean, the light in late afternoon coming off the harbor. The way the city is compact enough to know, but large enough to be quiet in when you need to be. I rented a flat near the waterfront for the first 6 months and set up a proper studio for the first time in my working life. Not a corner of a dining room table. Not a shared spare room with boxes stacked against the wall, but a room with north-facing light, and a door that closed and enough space to spread a large project across the floor and leave it there overnight. I took on bigger clients. I let go of the ones that had always drained more than they gave. I found a house in the north end of the city the following October. Small, bright, with original woodwork and a back garden that still had tomato cages left in it from whoever had tended it last. I made an offer exactly 1 year after that Thanksgiving dinner. I signed the documents alone, in my own name only, with my own funds. My own. Standing in that house on the day I collected the keys, I thought about something my grandfather used to say. That the things you build with your own hands are the only things no one can truly take from you. He wasn't talking about houses. He was talking about character, about the quiet, stubborn refusal to become smaller than you are just because someone is demanding it loudly enough. Fletcher's ultimatum, that pointing finger, and that voice that mistook volume for authority, had felt in the moment like a door being slammed in my face. Standing in my kitchen in Halifax, watching the autumn light come through the window and settle on the hardwood floor in the particular way it does in a house that is finally and completely yours, I understood what it actually was. It was the moment I stopped knocking on a door that had never been meant for me, turned around, and walked toward one that was. What would you have done if you'd been standing in my shoes that evening? I'd genuinely love to hear from you in the comments. And if this story reached you, please share it. You never know who else might be carrying something they needed permission to put down.